In 1979, two families stood in a forest clearing at 2 a.m., about to bet their children's lives on a homemade aircraft built from bed sheets and propane tanks. They had 28 minutes to reach the West or face execution. They had no engineering training, no flight experience, and they'd already failed twice. By 1978, East Germany had perfected the art of imprisonment on a national scale. The inner German border stretched 866 miles, a corridor of fences, watchtowers, minefields, and automatic guns. 50,000 armed guards patrolled it around the clock. Hundreds had died trying to cross. In the small town of Pößneck, two men worked together at a plastics factory. Peter Strelzyk was an electrician and former Air Force mechanic. Günter Wetzel was a bricklayer. They'd known each other 4 years, and like millions of East Germans, they talked constantly about getting out. Life in the GDR meant constant surveillance. You couldn't voice your opinions, not publicly, not even privately. You never knew if your neighbor, your colleague, or your friend was reporting to the Stasi. Travel was impossible. Career choices were limited to those who followed the party line. In early 1978, Wetzel's sister-in-law visited from the West. She'd escaped years earlier. She brought a magazine, and inside was an article about the International Balloon Fiesta in Albuquerque, New Mexico, photographs of hot air balloons drifting peacefully through the sky. Wetzel showed it to Strelzyk, and on March 7, 1978, they made a decision. They would fly their families over the border. Both families, 4 adults and 4 children, the youngest just 2 years old. Neither man had any experience with balloons. They didn't know the physics, they didn't know the engineering, they had no plans, no materials, and no margin for error. Their first attempt would take months of secret work and fail completely. But the real danger wasn't the failure itself, it was what came after. The first problem was fabric. They calculated they'd need around 900 square meters, enough to cover several tennis courts. In a surveillance state, buying that much material would trigger immediate suspicion. They drove 30 miles to a department store in Gera and told the clerk they needed tent linings for a camping club. It worked. For the next 2 weeks, Wetzel locked himself in his attic with his mother's 40-year-old foot-pedaled sewing machine, stitching the fabric into an envelope 15 meters wide and 20 meters long. Meanwhile, Strelzyk built the gondola, a steel frame with a sheet metal floor and clotheslines strung around the perimeter as walls. For the burner, he connected 2 propane bottles to a homemade nozzle using household pipes and a section of stovepipe. In April, they drove to a secluded forest clearing near Ziegenruck, 10 kilometers from the border. They lit the burner, and nothing happened. The balloon wouldn't inflate. The cotton fabric was too porous. The hot air leaked straight through. Months of work. 2,400 East German marks, all of it useless. Strelzyk burned the evidence in his furnace. They needed better fabric, a more powerful burner, and a way to inflate something the size of a building without being detected. But the real problem was trust. The two families were about to fall apart, and Strelzyk would attempt the next flight alone. Over the following months, the partnership fractured. Wetzel became convinced that Strelzyk was underestimating the risks. Arguments escalated. Finally, the Wetzels pulled out entirely. The families stopped speaking. Wetzel began exploring other ideas, a small airplane, maybe a glider. But Strelzyk pressed on with the balloon alone. He drove 100 miles to Leipzig and bought taffeta, claiming he was making sales for a sailing club. He motorized the sewing machine, and he solved the burner problem with a simple discovery. If you invert the propane tanks, the increased pressure produces a 12-meter flame. For the blower, he adapted the engine from Wetzel's old motorcycle, a 250 cubic centimeter MZ putting out 14 horsepower, connected to a Trabant starter powered by jumper cables from his Moskvich sedan, silenced with a Trabant muffler. East German engineering, improvised in a garage. On the night of July 3, 1979, the weather was perfect. A northerly wind, clear skies. The Strelzyk family, Peter, his wife Doris, and their 2 teenage sons, drove to a forest clearing and launched at 1:30 a.m. The balloon climbed 2,000 meters. Strelzyk had built an altimeter by modifying a barometer. They were drifting toward the border. Everything was working. Then they entered a cloud bank. Moisture condensed on the fabric, adding weight. The balloon began to descend. They landed in darkness, unsure where they were. Strelzyk explored until he found a piece of litter, a bread bag from an East German bakery. They had come down about 2 kilometers from the border, deep in a restricted zone. The family walked 8 miles back to their car in the dark. They made it home. But they'd left everything behind. The gondola, the burner, the deflated balloon. The Strelzyks had escaped the border zone, but they'd left everything behind. And buried in that debris was a single piece of evidence that would eventually lead the Stasi straight to Pößneck. A policeman actually found the balloon first, but he'd been collecting firewood illegally in a restricted zone, so he said nothing. It wasn't until July 20th that a hunter reported the wreckage. The Stasi mobilized immediately. They analyzed everything: the sewing patterns on the fabric, the welding technique on the gondola, the homemade altimeter. They issued a public appeal on August 14th, describing the equipment in detail and calling for citizens to report anyone who might have built it. And then they found a prescription wrapper among the debris, dropped during the chaotic landing. They traced it to a pharmacy in Pößneck. The investigation was closing in. Strelzyk destroyed every piece of evidence he could find and sold his car. Then he contacted Wetzel for the first time in months. The message was simple: they're going to find us. We have to go. Now. The Wetzels had followed the news. They understood that if the Strelzyks were caught, the investigation would lead straight to them. On July 27th, they agreed to try one more time. They would need to build a balloon twice as large as the last one. They'd need over 1,200 square meters of fabric, and they couldn't buy more than a few meters at a time without being reported. The Stasi was closing in, and they wouldn't get another chance. Wetzel went to his doctor, faked stomach problems, and got 5 weeks off work. Both families threw themselves into construction. The new balloon would be massive: 4,000 cubic meters, 20 meters in diameter, 25 meters tall. To avoid suspicion, they bought fabric in small quantities from stores across East Germany. Different colors, different patterns, whatever they could find. Taffeta, bed sheets, curtains, all of it stitched together. There was no time to test it. On September 15th, the weather shifted. A strong northerly wind. Perfect conditions. Wetzel was still sewing when the forecast came in. They finished the balloon as darkness fell. Both families loaded into their cars and drove to a meadow near Heinersdorf. 8 people, including children aged 2, 5, 11, and 15. At 2:26 a.m. on September 16th, they launched. Almost immediately, a tether failed to cut properly. The balloon tilted. The flame shot up toward the fabric, igniting part of it. They kept climbing. 2,000 meters. The air rushing through tears in the fabric kept extinguishing the burners. Strelzyk and Wetzel relit them by hand, over and over. Below them, West German radar detected an unidentified object moving toward the border. East German searchlights swept the sky, but the balloon was too high and too dark to see. 28 minutes after liftoff, the propane ran out. The balloon descended. They crashed into a forest clearing. Silence. Then, nothing. No guards. No sirens. Strelzyk and Wetzel told the women and children to hide, then walked toward a road. They saw headlights. A police car. "Are we in the West?" Strelzyk asked. The officer looked puzzled. "Of course you are. Where else would you be?" They had landed near Naila in Bavaria. The families emerged from the forest and opened a bottle of champagne. Within 3 hours of the escape, the Stasi arrested Peter's brother Erich. East Germany immediately restricted large fabric sales, required propane tanks to be registered, and closed small airports near the border. The Stasi launched Operation Burn, Operation Pear, a surveillance campaign targeting the family's relatives still in the East and anyone who might attempt a similar escape. They planted an informant in Strelzyk's West German television repair shop. They kept the Wetzels under watch. The harassment continued for years. The two families drifted apart in the media frenzy that followed. They settled in different towns and went their separate ways. After reunification, the Strelzyks moved back to Pößneck. Peter Strelzyk died in 2017 at 74. Günter Wetzel is still alive. The balloon, a patchwork of colors sewn together in an attic, carrying 8 people to freedom, now sits in a museum in Regensburg.